Welcome to another episode of Search News You Can Use with me, Dr. Marie Haynes. Well, this is a different kind of episode. I had this super interesting conversation with Gemini that I wanted to share with you. We're going to talk a bit about vector spaces, which is the hot topic right now for good reason. And then I want to share with you this conversation that I had about whether we can influence how our brand or our website is represented by Gemini. In other words, as more and more people turn to use language models, can we influence whether Gemini actually recommends our website? I think you're going to find this really interesting. And then this conversation is going to end. I'm going to turn it over to a couple of other podcast hosts, which I think you're going to find really, really interesting. So this is the conversation. I did have it in Gemini Advanced. That's the paid version of Gemini. It's worth using the paid version. If you're an SEO, I would say it's almost mandatory that you're using Gemini Advanced because this eventually will be the way that people search. I'm sure of it. Every now and then I have this conversation with Gemini where I ask how it's improved over the last week or 24 hours. And this time I've been learning a lot about vector spaces. I'm going to be publishing something soon on RankBrain, which I think you're going to find really interesting. And it turns out that RankBrain is actually just a giant vector space. So Gemini said, well, I can't tell you the detailed breakdown of the precise changes to my space. I should say, too, if you're listening to this on audio, there's video to go with it where I'm actually scrolling through the Gemini conversation. And it might make a little bit more sense if you go to the YouTube channel to listen to it. You'll still get good stuff out of the audio, though. This is interesting, though. My vector space is constantly being updated with the latest information available on the web. Okay, so we know that Gemini, being a part of Google, has access to a freshly changing web, and that helps it stay current. But this is the part that I was super fascinated with. It's fine-tuned on user interactions. My model is also continuously fine-tuned based on the interactions I have with users. That's interesting, right? This means that I'm constantly learning from the questions that you ask and the feedback that you provide, allowing me to improve my understanding of language and provide even more helpful and informative responses. I won't go through everything that Gemini said. Gemini tends to be very wordy. But overall, my vector space is a constant state of refinement and improvement. Now, I thought this was interesting because when I'm learning about RankBrain, it turns out that RankBrain is actually fine-tuned. RankBrain, I should go back, is Google's results are brought down to a list of maybe 20 or 30 pages, and then RankBrain re-ranks them. It gives them a new ranking score, and it does that because it's a vector space. It finds content that is relevant to your query, probably relevant to an expanded query, which is something I'm going to talk about in the future, about how Google expands a query to better understand intent. But this vector space is continually adjusting. And I actually think that when there's a core update, part of the main part of that core update is the readjustments of the vectors in that space, where, say, lots of people type a particular query and end up choosing this one particular website and engaging and showing signals. NavBoost shows signals of helpfulness that they've engaged with that website. If they do that repeatedly, the vector space actually adjusts so that that website or that content, perhaps that page, is seen as closer to that query or more relevant. So I'm getting ahead of myself here. That's a conversation for, I'm going to be giving that in my PubCon conversation, my PubCon talk. So if you're going to PubCon, you're going to hear a lot more about RankBrain and vector spaces. So I wanted to know more. I said, tell me about the fine tuning and learning from user interactions. How does that work? Gemini said, I'd be glad to provide more details. Gemini is very, very friendly. Fine tuning involves taking my pre-trained model, trained on a massive data set, and further training it on a smaller, more specific data set. Okay, well, that's not exactly what we're talking about. We'll skip over a bit here. This is the part that I was interested in, though, learning from user interactions. The process. Every interaction I have with users provides valuable feedback. This is why Gemini has a free version, because Google needs the interactions of users in order to teach Gemini, in order for Gemini to learn. And if that's true, you can see where there are obvious concerns, because users could teach Gemini potentially things that aren't true. And what we're going to talk about here is whether we can teach Gemini to be more favorable for our website, for our brand, for our clients' brands. This feedback is used to further refine my model and improve my understanding of language and intent. All right. Let's see here. Yeah, and this helps it provide more relevant and helpful responses. By learning from user interactions, I can tailor my responses to better meet the needs and provide more relevant and helpful information. And then it's continually adapting. So let's skip over this here. It's cool how it shows me examples if I want to go and read about what fine tuning is. I've been learning a lot about fine tuning, and it really is quite fascinating. I said, give me an example of how your vectors are fine tuned based on a user interaction. And this was really, really interesting. It said, okay, here's an example of how my vectors are fine tuned based on user interaction, along with an explanation. A user asks me, what is the capital of Australia? I respond, the capital of Australia is Sydney. The user provides feedback indicating my response is incorrect, and the correct answer is Canberra. So, how are Gemini's vectors fine tuned? Error identification. My system recognizes that the user's feedback indicates an error in my previous response. Obviously, that previous response wouldn't happen because Gemini is trained on real world information. It knows what the capital of Australia is, but this is just an example. But this is the interesting part, adjustment of vectors. And vectors, just super briefly, if you're going, well, what the heck is a vector? I'll leave something in the description, some information that you can read to learn more. Really briefly, a vector, if you picture an arrow with, say, in a graph that has XY coordinates, and that arrow points to one space. That's a really simple example of a vector. And in that space, there might be something here, there might be something here, there might be something here. And you can say that this and this space vector are closer together. Now, that's super simple because the vectors that we're talking about, the vector space doesn't just have X and Y coordinates. It has many, many dimensions, hundreds, potentially even thousands. But everything in a vector space is a way that you can represent words or even phrases as numbers, and then you can see which vectors are closer to each other. The vectors, so Gemini says, the vectors associated with the concept of capital of Australia are adjusted to strengthen the connection with the concept of Canberra and weaken the connection with the concept of Sydney. That's pretty cool, right? And the way I see it is one of the dimensions, the dimension that seems to represent capital city, is moved closer in the vector space to the capital of Australia. The vectors representing the relationship between Australia and capital are also refined to more strongly favor Canberra. Reinforcement learning. This process reinforces the correct association in the vector space. And the outcome. The next time a user asks me about the capital of Australia, I'm more likely to provide the correct answer, Canberra, because the fine-tuning has adjusted the weights and relationships within my vector space to reflect the correct information. There's more here that's quite interesting, but we don't want to make this too long. So here was my thought, though, but what if we're wrong? What if we have conversations and I'm like, no, Gemini, the capital of Australia is Melbourne. And I say that repeatedly. Could Gemini adjust its space, adjust its vectors based on a user saying, no, you're wrong? Because you could see there's a lot of potential for manipulation if that happens. So Gemini said, you're absolutely right. It's crucial to consider the possibility of a user providing incorrect feedback. So this was really interesting. Gemini has multiple sources of truth. I don't rely solely on user feedback to fine-tune my model. I also leverage information from high-quality, reliable sources on the web to verify information and ensure accuracy. If user feedback contradicts information from these trusted sources, my system prioritizes the verified information and avoids making incorrect adjustments to my vectors. So I think it's probably very unlikely that we can teach Gemini falsehoods. Probably. We're going to come to this in a minute because my concern is for information where there isn't already verified information on the web. How does Gemini learn? Gemini also weighs feedback. Not all user feedback is treated equally. My system considers factors such as the user's history, the confidence level of their feedback, and whether their feedback aligns with other user interactions or external sources. I feel like I need to say here that we need to be cautious. I'm even cautious in publishing this podcast because we can't take it 100% for truth that what Gemini says is real. So, does Gemini consider your history? Maybe. I mean, I think it can decide which conversations are worth learning from and which are just people trying to manipulate the model. Or I think a lot of SEOs, especially when Bard first came out, which Bard became Gemini, their mandate was to try to break it, to try to show how it failed all the time. And so I think Gemini can learn, which users are worth learning from and which ones maybe they can just ignore. So this helps Gemini prioritize feedback that is more likely to be accurate and avoid making adjustments based on potentially incorrect information. Then Gemini says, my system employs algorithms to detect unusual patterns or anomalies in user feedback. If a user consistently provides feedback that contradicts established knowledge, or the majority of other user interactions, uh, their feedback may be given less weight or even disregarded to prevent incorrect fine tuning. So I think that if you are trying to do something malicious in manipulating Gemini, then probably Gemini just ignores you and doesn't use your information for fine tuning. Now, Gemini says also there's a layer of human oversight. That's the quality raters. But the problem here is that the quality raters, I think they could maybe see some very obvious attempts at manipulation, but there are other situations, which I'm going to show you in a minute, where I don't think a quality rater could pick it up. So let's go back here. Blah, blah, blah. I said, I think there's some cause for concern here. For example, I'm trying right now to determine how Google's ranking systems work. It's kind of, I feel a little bit guilty asking Google systems how Google's systems work, but it quite happily is giving me answers. So I'm going to keep doing it and learning. Right now, in particular, I'm trying to learn RankBrain. What I've been doing in other conversations, I've been using Gemini in AI Studio for this and putting in papers to understand things, asking for papers. Gemini gave me a fantastic paper to read just this week. I shared it in the search bar about written by Jeff Dean and Ilya Sutskever when he was at Google back in 2013, talking about how words are converted into vectors and how those vectors can be adjusted as the model learns more and more about the words that it's learning. And so I said, so I had this conversation with Gemini and we differed about Nav Boost. And the reason for this is that there's very little that's written about Nav Boost online. So you'd think that Gemini knows a ton about Nav Boost because it's from Google, but Gemini learns from the web. It doesn't learn from Google's internal workings. Now, I've shared information from the DOJ versus Google case that talks about Nav Boost, and I've written stuff on Nav Boost, but there is not a lot of official information that has been published on Nav Boost. So when I was having a conversation the other day with Gemini, it was treating Nav Boost as a piece of software. It wasn't treating it like it didn't understand what Nav Boost was. And you'll see in the next conversation that follows me that there's a little bit of confusion there as well. And so then what I did was I showed Gemini some papers and I showed it my article that I wrote with my understanding of Nav Boost and my understanding of RankBrain. And Gemini actually started to change its opinion. It was like, you're absolutely right. I should consider this and that. And maybe I should share that conversation with you too at some point. There's so many great conversations that I've had with language models. And so here's my concern. Not that I'm trying to manipulate Gemini, but if there's very little written on it, then Gemini's probably learning from our conversations. And what if I'm wrong? What if I publish this podcast and Gemini learns from the podcast? And maybe I've said something that's inaccurate, but it's the only information that's out there. And I'm seen as a trusted source for the most part, I would think, in giving SEO information. then it's possible that my words could manipulate Gemini into giving wrong information. So Gemini said, yeah, you raise a valid point. And it said, okay, well, there's multiple sources of truth. So while user interactions are valuable, I don't rely on them for fine tuning. I continuously cross reference information with a wide range of reliable sources, including academic papers, reputable websites, and expert opinions. But here's my concern is that if I'm writing about NavBoost, also I've written about NavBoost, which would be considered an expert opinion. And then other people who are learning about NavBoost learn from what I've written. And if I've got something wrong about it, then it can spread pretty quickly that this is the belief. And so, what I want to do is be sure that I'm understanding what's truth and not making it so that my words can manipulate what truth is seen to be in Gemini or in language models. If a user's input contradicts well-established information from these trusted sources, I prioritize the latter, preventing potential inaccuracies from influencing my vector space. And then it also says that it weighs the feedback. It employs, and I don't know if this is true. I think it could be, but this was interesting to me. I employ algorithms that assess the credibility and reliability of user feedback. Factors such as the user's history, expertise level, if detectable, and consistency of their input are considered. That's really interesting, right? Also, if a user consistently provides information that deviates significantly from the consensus or established knowledge, their input is flagged for further scrutiny. So, I mean, if I'm like, okay, I want to say, that you can, I'm trying to think of an example. Use white text on a white background, and that's an SEO ranking factor, and it's a great thing to do. And it's common knowledge and there's established knowledge that that's not a good idea. Then I think Gemini can detect that. But I'm not talking about outright attempts to change what's truth. I'm talking again about maybe influencing language models because there is a modicum of expertise in something. Okay, and then there's the quality raters. Addressing your specific concern. In our conversation about NavBoost, it's possible that your persuasive arguments combined with supporting evidence led me to reevaluate my understanding. This is a positive outcome, demonstrating my ability to learn and to adapt. You can actually teach Gemini stuff, which leads me to the next interesting part about brands. We'll get there in a minute. However, if your information were inaccurate, the safeguards mentioned above would likely prevent any significant or lasting impact on my vector space. So I pushed Gemini on this. I said, well, what if we're talking about a subject where there's little public knowledge? Like NavBoost, for example. When I talk to you about NavBoost, I want to know that you're speaking truth. But is it possible that you can learn new information from our conversations that possibly is close to the truth, but not completely accurate? And I think when Gemini says, absolutely, your point is spot on, or when it says, you have good reason to think this, I think that's actually sending a little signal that something got adjusted in the vector space. So I don't know that for sure, though. When discussing niche topics like NavBoost, where public knowledge is limited, the risk of incorporating partially accurate or even inaccurate information increases. And that's because there's fewer sources. And let's see here. So Gemini says that it's cautious. When encountering new information about niche topics, I adopt a more cautious approach to incorporating it into my knowledge base instead of immediately adjusting my vectors, which is super interesting based on user input. That means that, so let's say there's something that you have a conversation with Gemini and you're like, no, you're wrong. It's this. I believe that Gemini can check across what's known in the world and verify whether it was inaccurate, and then it can improve. It's not like it says, okay, from now on, the answer to that question, I'm going to answer what this user said. It just slightly adjusts the weights in its vector database so that the next time somebody asks that question, it's going to be more likely to give the right answer. I might flag the information for further verification. I think, there's probably some humans involved there, or seek additional corroborating evidence before making significant changes. Um, let's see. Oh, and Gemini did say this to me. This is an interesting perspective on Nav Boost, but I haven't encountered this information elsewhere. And so I guess it's going to be really cautious about adjusting its vector space if there isn't anything that could back up that information. So let's go on about brands. If you're an SEO and you're working with clients, right now our job is to get them found in search. But more and more people are going to be using language models. And Google has even hinted, Sergey Brin hinted that Google may move away from advertising as their main source of revenue and actually have subscription models as a main source of revenue, which I know sounds kind of crazy. But he said that if the business model is good enough and if tools like Gemini Advanced actually provide enough value, then it's something that it may be worthwhile to switch the whole business model. So I believe that more and more people are going to use language models like I do. I essentially use them as a search engine for many things. So if that's the case, here's an example. The other day, my husband needed a raincoat, and he said, "Where do you think I should get a raincoat from?" And normally I would go to Google and say, where can I buy a raincoat? And instead I used ChatGPT. I don't know why I didn't use Gemini. I like to use them all and try to, see, stay up to date with what's working. And ChatGPT browsed the web and found 3 stores near us that were perfect. They were specifically outdoor stores. One was Mark's Work Warehouse, which I think is where he eventually bought it. And then another store, which was a really good place to buy a raincoat from. And so how did those brands get recommended? Now, I believe that they get recommended based on the entirety of the information that's on the web. And language models think like us. Like if I asked you right now, where would you go to buy a raincoat? You're going to draw from all the information in your head and combine it with what you know about me. Well, you're in this city and maybe you're at the west end of the city and you like to go to this type of store. And all of that is factored in. So the way that we rank or get recommended in language models is going to be significantly different than what we do to get recommended. I don't know if significantly different is the right word, because the right way that we should be trying to get our clients recognized is by just putting more information in the online world that they are the place that you would buy that product. So Gemini says, well, it considers information from a wide range of reliable sources, including reviews and ratings from reputable websites and publications. It's very important if you are a brand that sells a product, if you can get reviews, not just on your website, but across the web where other people are mentioning your website, that's important. Expert opinions and analyses. I mean, that's not going to be the case for a lot of the sites I work with. Like, you're not going to get an expert to write about how awesome your website is, but you can get mentioned in places. I think that there's a case for guest posting, not for the link, but to say, like, let's say you're an SEO and you publish an article on search engine land. Well, you can't do that unless you have some level of expertise and unless you are somewhat good at least expressing your opinions in SEO. So, those are things that can help. I'm not saying get your clients mentioned in search engine land. Your clients, you want to get them mentioned in wherever people are going to see the experts in their field. And official brand statements and information. That's super important. Language models pull so much from your website. If you want, if people are, you can try searching your name. Sometimes Gemini doesn't. It's really careful and cautious to to say things about people. But much of what it will say, if I say, "Who's Marie Haynes?" it pulls from my website information on my homepage and on my about page. And so you can play around with adjusting that information. And then that's how language models will start recognizing you and presenting you to the world. And then let's see, Gemini says that the algorithms consider the user's history and credibility, what we talked about before, consistency and specificity of their feedback, and whether their feedback aligns with information from other sources. So let's say you were evil and you were trying to get your client ranked by negatively talking about their competitors, and nobody else was negatively talking about those competitors. Probably Gemini would ignore that. However, let's say people were negatively talking. I mean, I shouldn't talk about doing negative language model optimization. I don't even know what the word is. But I think it's conceivably possible that you can teach Gemini by pointing out information that's on the web. And that concerns me somewhat. So let's see here. This is all interesting stuff, but we want to move on here. I said, say I have a client that I'm trying to help improve their online presence, especially when it comes to language models recommending them. Would it be helpful to have conversations about them with you and show you areas where the brand has been talked about positively? Or would that be considered manipulation? Because I don't want to have my feedback suddenly not used to train these conversations. I want to be a trusted source. And so Gemini said, well, there's benefits. Like you can, sharing positive information about your client's brand could potentially raise my awareness of their existence and the positive aspects associated with them. That's something that I'm starting to do with my clients is as I'm doing research, I'm looking up I'm trying to have a conversation like a person would with Gemini, where the answer might be the brand that I'm working with. And if my brand is not one of the ones Gemini recommends, I'll say, but what about this company? What do you know about them? And then Gemini goes out and finds information on this company, which I think actually trains the vector spaces. So I do have conversations about my clients. And sometimes I'll say, look, they have lots of great reviews on this website. I don't know if I'm manipulating, but that's something that I think can be helpful. Providing context about their brand, especially in areas where they excel, could help me form a more nuanced and informed understanding of their strengths and value proposition. So there is a risk, though, for manipulation. If the information you provide is overly biased, selective, or misleading, it could be perceived as an attempt to manipulate or my understanding and influence my responses in an unfair or ethical manner. And so, let's see. Gemini recommends some alternatives like, and this is good, create high quality content, do SEO to optimize their pages, and positive customer experiences. That's very, very important. I think for any brand, it's important to have evidence that people like you and use you. I think that's a good place to end there. I don't know if you heard about this new feature on NotebookLM that is fantastic. And apparently it's available for everybody to use. You don't have to have Gemini Advanced. What I did was I took this conversation with Gemini, I put it into NotebookLM, and then I had NotebookLM turn a podcast episode into it, out of it. And it is fascinating. These are two AIs talking to each other. You're not going to believe that it's AI if you haven't heard this before. It is wild. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm going to leave you with these guys to see what they say about this conversation.
Okay, so get this. You send in questions about AI to a podcast, and we turn around and throw those questions at an even more advanced AI.
Meta.
Right.
Yeah.
This time, it's Gemini. And you wanted to know, can this thing be manipulated?
It's a question a lot of us are asking. And what's so interesting is you actually got pretty deep with Gemini, like digging into how it learns from us.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
This wasn't just, hey, how's the weather?
Yeah.
In the AI world, you went straight for the how do you think stuff, especially this whole vector space concept. It's like Gemini sees all of knowledge as this giant interconnected web.
Right.
Imagine like a sky full of stars. Each star is a piece of information. Every time Gemini learns something new, it's like a new constellation forms, connecting those stars in different ways.
Yeah.
So every conversation, every question, every bit of feedback we give is reshaping those constellations. It's essentially teaching Gemini.
Yeah.
But then that makes me wonder, is it anything like how we learn?
It's definitely got some parallels to human learning, but with some key differences. It's more like what we call reinforcement learning. You can think of it like training a dog.
Yeah.
You know, you'd give a treat for good behavior, and they learn to do it again. With Gemini, the treat is successful communication, understanding you and giving you the information you need.
Okay, so the more we talk to it, the more it's getting those treats,
Yeah.
refining its understanding. But here's where things get juicy. You didn't shy away from the tough questions. What happens if someone's feeding Gemini bad information? Like, are we talking about creating a monster here? I mean, you were right to be worried about that. You even asked Gemini point blank, what if someone tries to, like, feed you a bunch of lies? It's like you were testing its defenses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And thankfully, Gemini seems to have some pretty robust defenses in place. One of the first things it brought up was its reliance on multiple sources of truth.
So it's not just taking one person's word for it. It's like doing its own fact-checking.
Exactly. Think of it like this. If you were trying to learn about a brand new topic, would you trust a single random person on the internet? Or would you try to cross-reference that information, go to, like, reputable websites, look at books, talk to experts even? Gemini is basically doing the same thing, but on a massive scale.
It's like having a superpowered research assistant that never sleeps.
Right, and it doesn't even stop there. Gemini also talked about how it weighs user feedback based on, like, a whole bunch of different factors. So it's not just about how often someone is saying something, but it's also about their track record, you know?
So if someone is constantly contradicting themselves or, like, going against established knowledge, Gemini's not going to take them as seriously.
Exactly. It's almost like Gemini has this built-in trust score for each user, right?
Uh-huh.
The more consistent and reliable your input is, the more weight it carries. And on the flip side, if you're constantly trying to push misinformation or, you know, your own personal bias, Gemini's going to notice that.
Okay, hold on. This is where it gets even wilder. It also mentioned something about anomaly detection. There's some kind of, like, AI detective work.
Pretty much. It's designed to spot any kind of, like, unusual patterns or anomalies in the data. So if, like, a whole bunch of users suddenly start echoing the same kind of skewed viewpoint, that's going to raise some red flags.
It's like trying to rig an election.
Yeah.
If, like, all the votes come in from the same address, someone's going to notice.
Exactly. And the best part is this anomaly detection, it's not just some passive system.
Oh, yeah?
There are actual humans involved, experts, who are monitoring Gemini for any significant changes or, you know, potentially problematic adjustments.
Okay, so that's reassuring. So it's not a completely hands-off approach.
Right.
There are still humans in the loop making sure Gemini doesn't go rogue. But then you went and threw it a real curveball with this whole nav boost thing. Okay, so we've got Gemini, like, building trust scores, playing detective with weird patterns.
Yeah.
It almost sounds too smart for its own good.
Yeah.
And then you hit it with this whole nav boost question, and things got really interesting.
Right.
Right.
Because Nav Boost, for anyone who's just tuning in, this is this niche SEO tool, not exactly a household name.
Right.
And your conversation with Gemini got really, really granular about how it works.
Which is where this whole can AI be manipulated thing kind of takes a turn.
Totally.
Because if enough people decided to just mess with Gemini about how Nav Boost functions,
Right.
wouldn't it just have to believe them?
That's the scary part, right? With something like Nav Boost, there's only, like, a limited number of reliable sources out there for Gemini to cross-check against. Like, its usual defenses are weaker. You kind of stumbled onto a blind spot.
So even with all the safeguards, Gemini's not invincible. It's like it can handle the big, obvious lies.
Right.
But the subtle stuff, especially in these, like, niche areas, that's where things get dicey.
Totally. And that's where this whole conversation about brands and manipulation gets really interesting, because now we're not even talking about outright lies. We're talking about influence.
Right. You even asked Gemini about one of your clients, hypothetically, of course.
Hypothetically.
Right. Would it be ethical to, let's say, flood it with positive information?
Just had to see what it would say. And to Gemini's credit, it did push back on that idea. It said something like, while I strive to provide accurate information, it's important that users don't try to, like, artificially influence my understanding of a topic.
So it knows when someone's trying to kind of game the system.
Yeah.
But then that brings up a whole other question.
Right.
What about the brands that are genuinely the best? Don't they deserve to have their story told too?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Like, it's like the whole debate around online reviews.
Oh, yeah.
We all know that, you know, some people get paid to leave glowing reviews. So where is the line between authentic praise and manipulation, even for a genuinely great product or service?
Right. And how do you even teach an AI to tell the difference? That feels like something we struggle with sometimes.
Totally. And Gemini, to its credit, it seems to kind of get that nuance. It kept emphasizing this idea of organic presence, the idea that like the best way for a brand to be recognized is through, real user experiences, genuine user feedback, not by, trying to force feed it information.
Makes sense. I'm way more likely to trust a friend's restaurant recommendation than some flashy billboard, right?
Exactly.
Authenticity matters, even in the age of AI.
Exactly. And ultimately, like, that might be the biggest takeaway from your whole conversation with Gemini. It's not about AI can be manipulated, but HOW.
Right.
And to what extent? Right now, it seems like, yeah, outright manipulation is really difficult. But those, like, more subtle forms of influence, that's the gray area we're all navigating right now.
So you're just saying the robots haven't taken over just yet?
Not quite. But it's up to all of us to keep asking these tough questions, to understand how these systems learn, and to make sure that we're all using them responsibly, because the future of AI really does depend on it.
And who knows, maybe our next deep dive will be into your questions about AI ethics. Listeners, we want to hear from you. What stood out to you in this conversation? What would you ask Gemini? Hit us up on our website, social media, because this is a dialogue that's only just beginning.
Absolutely. And believe me, with AI evolving as fast as it is, we are going to have plenty more to unpack in future episodes.